Why do I get the feeling that the entire pitch of this episode started from the writers wanting to get on to be able to punch a dinosaur? And I can't really fault them. It's fun to have Lon punch a dinosaur, so I'll give them that. Hello interwebs, I hope you are all doing well because it is one of my favorite times on this channel. I get to review new Star Trek episodes. This one starting Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 4, which is ultimately going to be the penultimate season of the show, as the show has already shot and been renewed for its 5th and what will be its final season, which will have 6 episodes after this 10-episode season. And that, along with the upcoming Starfleet Academy Season 2, after which that show has gotten canceled, will bring this era of Star Trek that began with Star Trek Discovery in 2017, presumably to an end, unless something changes, as we move into this new era of the Paramount regime and the Ellisons of it all, which we are not going to touch upon for this review, but certainly is definitely something to not fully ignore given everything going on with fucking Paramount right now. But we're just going to focus on this and the creatives involved in this show that certainly had not anything to do with that Paramount stuff, because this was all shot and written and done before all of that took place. Anyways, who knows what's going on with Star Trek, but we have at least 26 more episodes of this era of Star Trek to review. So let us dive into it. And to start us off, I have to be very honest. I say it's one of my favorite things to do, but frankly, I have been dreading having to review this season of Strange New Worlds, because it's by no means a secret, if you watched any of my coverage of last season of Strange New Worlds, that I found last season to not only be disappointing, but actively angering and frustrating. While a lot of those last season's episodes I found to just be dull, boring, and regurgitative of previous Star Trek, such as let's do a holodeck episode, let's do a Trelane/Q episode, and just sort of playing the greatest hits of Star Trek without having much to say other than wanting to bang together action figures, there were also episodes of last season that actively frustrated me, like the absolutely horrific 4.5 Vulcans, which leaned into problematic eugenics and racist stereotyping elements, as well as really just weird themes of the season as a whole surrounding heteronormativity constantly being brought up with no queer characters whatsoever, despite Star Trek having had so many queer characters over the past few years, and every character needing to end up in some sort of very high school childish style relationship where it's like, oh, we don't know how to talk about our problems, da 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 da, and it very much feeling like Love Boat in space. I did a whole video on my issues with last season of the show, and it's very centrist, not wanting to say anything, not committing to anything, and ultimately reproducing a lot of normative views that Star Trek generally should be challenging over on my main channel, so check out that video essay. But it has led me coming into this season very hesitant to want to watch this show. I have liked Strange New Worlds in the past. While I've had issues with it, seasons 1 and 2 certainly had a lot more highs, even while it did have some issues. But last season really just put me down on the show, and I'm at a place with the show where I don't really entirely trust it, to the point where I was debating whether I even wanted to cover this season. But considering that I am a huge Trekkie, I am going to watch these episodes regardless, because, I like writing about Star Trek, I like discussing Star Trek, it's part of my job to discuss this. And then on top of that, we are 26 episodes away from this era of Star Trek ending, so it is certainly, might as well just wrap it all out and bring us to the end of this. And so with that decision made, especially also considering that these episodes were made before this current regime of Paramount, I at least settled on I will at least review these last 26 episodes, the last 2 seasons of Strange New Worlds and Starfleet Academy, which Academy I like a hell of a lot more, despite the, toxic narrative around that show. And so what I've decided to do is I am going to try my best to come into every single episode trying to find the positive, not coming in to bash on the show to be like, fucking Strange New World, I gotta watch this shit. I want to come into this episode and every episode of this series to try to, give it a chance, to try to let it try and stand on its own. That is not to say I'm not going to talk about some of the context of the show and what some elements of an episode that I'm watching feels to me within the context of the show, but I'm at least going to try to come into this season with an open heart to try to give it its own chance. Especially considering, season 3 was written during the writer's strike. Maybe there's a chance for the show to prove me wrong, to step up, to change its course a little bit. But who knows, considering that this season was written and shot, I believe, before season 3 was even released, so they couldn't really course correct. So we'll see, but that's at least the mindset I'm coming into this season with. That being said, and I'm going to stay spoiler-free on my thoughts for this episode for just a little bit, and then I will get into spoilers in just a few moments. Frustratingly, I did not like this season premiere. I think first and foremost with this season premiere, I found it to be, again, staying spoiler-free, kind of dramatically inert. There are some ideas and themes in this episode that I do like, that I think they are trying to explore in a very Star Trekian way, but I didn't find them to be all that dramatically interesting. It really just comes down to characters kind of talking in rooms, and not even a lot of tension within that discussion. And certainly I love a Star Trek conference room scene, but there was not a ton of drama going on in these storylines. On top of that, the pacing of this episode is really, really wonky. It takes a significant amount of time for us to get into the actual plot of this episode. It takes 15 minutes to finally get us there. And that first 15 minutes is setting up storylines that kind of get abandoned within the middle of the episode and then brought back up at the end of the episode. And some of them feel like they are tying into larger storylines that are going to go on this season, which is fine, but it ultimately feels like this episode is kind of weighted down by having to toss a plot in the middle of its bookends that are trying to set up other things of the show, rather than weaving those storylines more naturally into the episode itself, like season 1 of the show was better able to do, where we would have storylines that would come up within an episode that would be tied off later on, but felt like they were more naturally woven within the storyline and plot, rather than just appearing at the beginning, appearing at the end, and then we had a plot for the episode in between. So that was very frustrating. And then, it would be one thing if this episode for me was just a little bit boring, but the episode ends on a decision by Captain Pike that the episode tries to justify within the setup of the episode, but for me, I found to be particularly galling and appalling for a Star Trek episode to even set up as the storyline, and it doesn't really justify the really dark choice that it goes for at the end here, that I maybe could have gotten behind if it had justified it better, but really it just sort of throws up its hands and said, well, this is just the way it has to be, and I found to be kind of galling for a Star Trek episode to be doing. We'll have to talk about that in spoilers, so I don't want to spoil the episode overall, but I particularly found the end of this episode to be very angering and upsetting. And then on top of that, to go into sort of the context of the show overall, there are storylines set up in this episode, particularly around characters such as La'an and also Ortegas and Scotty, that just given what this show did last season, this show may not go in a direction that I dislike with these characters and these storylines that they are setting up in this episode, but given how the show has handled very similar plot lines before in the show, does not have me, I am very concerned about where they are going to go overall with those storylines. Again, I am going to try and go into it with an open heart and allow the show to prove me wrong, hopefully, about where it's going with those storylines, but I'll at least have to flag, I don't know, you have proven to me that you cannot handle these types of stories well. You could, and maybe you will, but right now I'm sort of sitting like, I don't necessarily trust you to do so, especially given what you do with this episode and its ideas. And frankly, the last thing that I will say about this episode before we get into actual full spoilers for it is that it does the exact same thing that I was frustrated with last season, which is this is just an episode of a show that is blank, but in Star Trek. In this case, it is essentially Princess of Mars in Star Trek. And that's not really a spoiler because that's kind of in the trailer for the season, where we have Captain Pike literally quoting Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I want to note that over on my main channel, I did a video essay on Star Trek Starfleet Academy, and in that video, I talked briefly about that trailer, and I said this. Dear God, they did drop the trailer for Season 4 of Strange New Worlds before I filmed this video, and That trailer opened up with Pike quoting known eugenicist and scientific racism fan Edgar Rice Burroughs.
I have ever been prone to seek adventure and to investigate where wiser men would have left well enough alone.
And I bet you that that's just setting up a Princess of Mars but Star Trek homage in Season 4, because that's all Strange New Worlds is now, just blank, but in Star Trek. And guess what? I called it. That is exactly what this episode does, and it does another thing that I said in that video as well, that we will talk about too, which also upsets me. The problem with doing this Princess of Mars, but in Star Trek, is I'm fine with the show doing homages or send-ups of Star Trek, of other literature. Star Trek has always kind of done that. We've had, Deep Space Nine do episodes that were like Casablanca in space, or, having, Tom Clancy in Star Trek or something like that, like doing a Hunt for the Red October in Star Trek, for example. And this show has also done it fairly well, where it did like Ursula K. Le Guin, The Ones Who Walk Away from Only Lost, in its first season. But the show has repeatedly, over and over and over again, constantly done those homages, and usually does homages to other science fiction, such as Xenomorphs in space with the Gorn. And I get that you're fans of sci-fi, but if you're doing homage to other sci-fi within sci-fi, but not tying them necessarily into the themes of Star Trek, it's just ultimately just cribbing from someone else's work and not making a Star Trek show. And that's kind of what's done here. I don't mind if you steal from science fiction every once in a while, but you should also, if you're going to be drawing homages, which you shouldn't be doing all the time, but if you're going to be drawing homages, draw from outside of science fiction. Bring more things in, rather than pulling from the same genre that we're already within. It's why something like Star Wars kind of worked a lot of the time, and why the original Star Trek worked, because they were pulling from westerns and samurai films to bring into the science fiction genre, political storylines to bring into the science fiction genre, rather than stealing from other science fiction to do more science fiction. And it really frustrates me, especially given, by the way, that Edgar Rice Burroughs himself is a noted eugenicist, and I get that Princess of Mars is an important work of science fiction. It certainly had a lot of influence. So I'm not going to overly knock the episode for, referencing it as just a work of science fiction. But there is a part of me that is rubbed a little bit the wrong way, where we're going to be sending up Edgar Rice Burroughs, known eugenicist, even despite his important science fiction work, and not really address that, or, maybe pull from other science fiction writers who have less problematic backgrounds. But this episode directly calls out Edgar Rice Burroughs and Princess of Mars by the end of it. And there's no critical engagement with that. It's just like, hey, look, this is a cool science fiction thing, and I get it, it's important work of science fiction, but I don't know if it's necessarily something we should be fully celebrating, given its white savior aspects of that story alone, as well as the problematic views of the creator. Even though, there are worthwhile acknowledgments of its importance within the science fiction genre's history. All that being said, I have sort of danced around the actual discussion here, so let us get into full spoilers here. And last chance to jump off here, but now that we are in full spoiler mode, I have to play this other part of that clip from my Star Trek Starfleet Academy video essay, because I also called it there too. Because that's all Strange New Worlds is now, just blank, but in Star Trek. Oh, and I guess we're doing dinosaurs now, which I swear to God, if the Enterprise goes back in time and does some stupid shit like cause the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, I might just scream. So, yeah. The idea that I just came up with on a whim while I was filming the video is the easiest and silliest and least creative option is exactly what this episode does. Yay. Alright, so full spoilers ahead for this episode. Let me start off with going through the episode and saying things that I do really like about this right up front. Is I do like the horseback riding scene that we got at the start here, and Pike sort of tying back into that. And I like that Pike is dealing with the fallout of last season, and him essentially being, as we talk about later on in the episode, a widower, and dealing with, the loss of Batel. I have many issues with that Batel storyline, such as the heteronormativity of it, the fact that Batel essentially got fridged and literally put on a pedestal, like all women get put on a pedestal and must, die for the goodness of humanity, as a lot of women are tended to have to be put on, oh, my love saves the universe, as she literally says in the...
The love I feel is brighter than your darkness. Your judgment is here.
stupidity of just that good versus evil storyline at the end of last season overall. Anyways, it was just a bad storyline, and I don't like the treatment of Patel within that, but I do at least like that we're getting some emotional carryover for Pike. It at least adds something to his character, even if it is sort of a stereotypical, like, my woman died storyline here. And I like that it is coming out in the ways of he is just trying to focus on the now, like, not getting in his head, just wanting to do mission after mission after mission, and it tiring out the crew. I thought that was, an interesting idea of him just kind of being stuck in the now and not wanting to look at the past or the future, considering we know that he knows the future. And I like that hangs over this episode, especially as he is offered a promotion by Admiral April, but it's never overtly said. And I like that there's just awareness of like, yeah, he would be thinking about that because he knows what his fate's going to be. And so, he's constantly being pulled about what's happened to him in the past and his traumas from losing Patel, and also his fear of the future and what's going to happen to him, and just wanting to focus on the now. And both of those things aren't so directly stated, but certainly linger on the edges of his character. And I thought that was decently well handled for an arc for his character within this episode, that I really did ultimately like. But unfortunately, we tie into things that I dislike, because we have, when La'an comes back up to the ship, we have a reminder that she and Spock are still in a relationship. As much as I love the whole, like, hey, Spock is horny for La'an element here, he just wanted to see her in a cowboy outfit, that is kind of fun, and I do enjoy that little element. It is a storyline that I just don't like. I don't like the relationship drama that all of last season did, and I did not like the relationship between La'an and Spock, just generally speaking. So I'm frustrated that it's still a thing going on that we're dealing with here, even if there's a little bit of fun in the whole, like, Spock's horny for a cowgirl element of it, that I do. Spock's just a horse girl, deep down inside, and, he needs to express it in some way. The other element here that I need to flag that I did not, let me put it this way. I don't mind it within this episode, but I don't trust it, which is the kind of rivalry between Ortegas and Scotty. There's something fun about, like, Scotty messing with Ortegas and the sort of back and forth between the two of them, and I like sort of them needling each other throughout the episode, like when Ortegas goes down to the planet that they get to in this episode, and she's sort of, like, making fun of his accent and stuff like that, and things, and, like, Scotty sort of adding more beeps to her console just to frustrate her. I do find that to be a little bit fun. But again, I have to look at the context of the show a little bit and be like, is this setting up Ortegas and Scotty having a romance? Is this just them sort of like setting up them flirting? Especially since we have so many looks of Scotty in this episode of like him looking at Spock and La'an and sort of like their relationship and sort of glancing at them and being awkward at certain moments. And I worry that they're setting up a relationship between these two characters. And for the love of God, can we please not have another romance on this show, especially with a character like Ortegas, who, you can read her any way that you want, but, like, for me, has always kind of had a little bit of a lesbian coding to her, especially since she had a little bit of sexual tension in the fantasy episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 1, with Una, when they both had their sort of mind wiped in the fantasy episode that we had in that season.
Not to contradict you, but we know each other quite well.
Quite well.
But you're not supposed to.
There was hints, and maybe it was just with the actors, of like Ortegas kind of having a queer subtext to her character, and certainly has that coding to her character. And I just, given the overall heteronormativity of the show, to just have another heteronormative relationship and to do it with a character Ortegas who, maybe isn't necessarily intended to be queer, but certainly has been read that way by some folks, would be very frustrating to see. It reminds me of Tasha Yar and how many people sort of read a sort of lesbian coding onto the character, and many queer people sort of identified with that. And then the show in season 1 of Next Generation took a lot of pains to be like, well, she's just this way because she had sexual assault trauma, and she really just wants to be more girly girl like Troy.
I need your advice. That's why I came to your quarters.
Of course, anything I
On
can do.
clothes. You always wear such beautiful clothes off duty. And your hair always looks so nice. I want to change my image. What do you...
Sort of like, oh, we got to straighten out the butch woman, sort of thing. And having that here in 2026 would kind of frustrate me, even if that's not the overt intention. It is, again, the fact that this show constantly relies on normative, hegemonic sort of cultural assumptions and biases rather than exploring them or pushing against them. Not just against queer coding ways, but in masculinity and gender dynamics with like Pike and having the fridge girlfriend and that whole element. In many other ways, political ideas and things that the show is constantly doing, not just in gender and sexuality as well. But this is just another element of it, and hopefully that's not where we're going with it, but it is something that I need to flag. Hopefully not. Hopefully not. And if it is just a fun little rivalry between friends, it is... I'm good with that, but unfortunately I have to look at it a little bit within the context of the show, and it gives me a little bit reticent for where we're going with this. Another thing that also frustrates me here is we have Uhura's Vulcan cadet. And I like this element of Uhura getting a cadet and not necessarily knowing how to connect with the cadet, even though she wants to be a good mentor, but two things with it. One is, with our Vulcan cadet here, it feels like an echo and maybe even a cribbing from Star Trek Lower Decks, where we had a very similar dynamic between Tendi, and also Mariner to a degree, and T'Lyn, the Vulcan cadet, I guess ensign, I think, in that show, where Tendi wanted to be a mentor to T'Lyn and didn't necessarily know how to perfectly be that mentor to her, and it feels very similar in dynamic.
Hi, I'm Tendi. Welcome to the Cerritos. We're gonna be training together.
Greetings. I am T'Lyn. Is there someplace quiet where we can discuss my orientation?
First, you gotta meet everyone. Guys, this is my new study buddy!
But what makes this, I think, slightly worse than that is we're kind of doing a Vulcan stereotype with this character, to the point where at the end of the episode, Ortegas literally even says, like, when Uhura can't really connect with this character, Ortegas says, like, well, maybe she's just very Vulcan and that's it. Maybe you just can't connect with her because she's being very Vulcan. And that feels like a very racist stereotype. Again, it's like, you know, I get it, Vulcans are just an alien species, but it's like within the universe of the show, that is kind of racial stereotyping of, oh, just Vulcans are like that. They're just very Vulcan. She's very Vulcan. Like, replace that with, like, oh, she's just very black. Black people are kind of like that. And it's weird. You know what I'm saying? And it's, again, sci-fi alien, but it is Star Trek sort of relying on stereotype and racial stereotyping within the context of its universe in a way that I really find to be problematic for a Star Trek show to be doing in 2026. It was problematic to be doing in the 60s when, you know, Kirk and McCoy would kind of do that to Spock and call him a green-blooded Vulcan, and it's frustrating to see them do it here, especially when, again, comparing to Tendi and T'Lyn's relationship, T'Lyn was not a stereotypical Vulcan. She, you know, she was certainly more logical and sort of grew up in the culture of Vulcan, but was her own person as well, and had her own idiosyncrasies that, you know, obviously made her, you know, leave, you know, the Vulcans to join Starfleet, as her storyline goes. But, you know, even if she was a sort of more normative style Vulcan, having more of a individual personality that this Vulcan character does not. She's just sort of like the stereotype of aggressive, asshole-ish Vulcan. And I'm just frustrated, especially in the context of last year's 4.5 Vulcans, that we're still doing that within this show. And also she has, by the way, a snide sort of comments like, maybe it's easier for Spock because he's half human. I'm like, oh, we're going to do more of the half-human, you know, biracial nonsense with Spock that is very racializing as well with him. That the show, like, it's not an illegitimate thing to address, you know, racism within Vulcan culture towards Spock, but this show has, again, certainly shown a lack of desire to do anything with. One thing I will call out here is I do like the conference room scene where we explain the scientific phenomenon that they're going to eventually get sucked into at the start of this episode, and Pike saying, where's your sense of exploration, to Spock, and Pelia being the one to say, oh yeah, let's go out and explore. I love seeing strange phenomenon. That felt very Star Trek-ian to me. But one other thing to note too here is that they're doing the thing with Pelia that I was frustrated by last season, which is she's just here to be a kind of joke machine and not getting a ton of characters. She's just sort of here to give a few different quips. And even within this episode, she also makes an oblong reference to Doctor Who, saying, you know, she was in a phone box at the time, which this show has already done a few cute sort of references to Doctor Who. Last season, they had a few overt references to it, including having the TARDIS literally being outside the Enterprise in one quick Easter egg, blink it and you'll miss it moment. And I think that that's cute once, maybe even twice, but now you're just having Pelia constantly make, you know, jokes, and then now consistently make Easter egg references to another show, and it gets a little bit tiring. Once or twice is cute, but over and over and over again, I think it's doing it way too much. And I had hoped that they would have finished that off last season. Also, it's kind of an unfortunate time considering everything going on with Doctor Who right now, and how that in many ways kind of a little bit mirrors what's going on with Star Trek right now, as both shows are kind of in a odd fallow period after many, many years having, been doing tons of shows and episodes and seasons. And also, the last thing I'll say on this front, because I'm only talking about the first 15 minutes, all of this storyline stuff is just in the first 15 minutes, and it kind of goes away within the middle of the episode. It kind of pops up a little bit with like Ortegas and Scotty, but a lot of this setup is just stuff that happens on the edges of this episode, because we get into the actual plot of the episode, and due to a bootstraps paradox, the Enterprise is thrown back in time to the Sol system, and we learn that there's another planet in the Sol system that didn't exist there before, and that Mars is occupied. And again, we are doing a Princess of Mars sort of send up here, with Princess of Mars again being written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, certainly a very influential work of science fiction, but was a storyline where you have John Carter of Mars getting sent to Mars, a Confederate soldier, I believe, and becoming sort of the savior of the Martian people because he has extra strength on Mars because of the lower gravity. And again, influential piece of science fiction, and certainly Edgar Rice Burroughs, who also wrote Tarzan, has been a very influential writer. But certainly there's like a white saviorness to that storyline in it. And again, Edgar Rice Burroughs had his own very problematic other books that he wrote outside of those stories. You should look it up. There's a whole section of Wikipedia about it. And, this episode doesn't necessarily dive into those aspects of it, thank God. But it's, again, a weird thing to be doing, especially since the show has also delved into themes of eugenics and does a little bit even at the end of this episode, too, as we'll get into, to sort of leave that uncritically addressed and be pulling from this writer. It signals a weird thing given the show's own failures with handling themes of eugenics and genetics and things like that. It just feels like, oh, either these folks are signaling something more nefarious or just completely ignorant. And I would rather presume ignorance on behalf of the writers than something more nefarious, but it's certainly, it's not good, I think, is the thing to say here. There are going to be people who have like canon issues with this. We see dinosaurs and things, and in Star Trek Voyager, we also learned that dinosaurs got technology. Like, it's actually a very good episode of Voyager where we see like dinosaurs got off the planet and became intelligent and didn't even believe that they came from Earth. And it's a really good episode. I would highly recommend it.
If a saurian species had developed language and technology, you'd think they would have left something behind. But what if it evolved on an isolated continent?
A landmass that was destroyed.
And certainly this doesn't necessarily, I think, fully line up with that element of things. But, I'm always okay with ignoring other canon of Star Trek if you're going to tell me a good storyline. Unfortunately, I don't think this one is all that... It's not that it's not good, it's just that it's uninteresting. Because we have this Commander Cassell sort of take the Enterprise hostage and wanting to steal its... weapons, because she is in the war with this insectoid species, the Doldrum. And what I like about this setup, and I do think that this is something that I do appreciate this episode for doing, is we see that this commander, Cassell, only knows war, and she only thinks in terms of war. And so it's hard for her to understand and grasp what the Federation is. And I like Pike and the rest of the crew having to explain to her a different way of thinking about relationships, of like, when he says, oh, Pike says the carrot or the stick, Cassell sort of presumes that the carrot is a weapon. And it's like, oh, is this a different type of weapon? You use two different types of weapons? Like, no, this is like, we try to reach out to people. And she sort of still frames it in a like, oh, so you pretend to be benevolent and then you use the stick. And it's certainly a strategy. And I like those sort of discussions of she's her mindset is so bought into only seeing an us versus them worldview that, she can't really conceptualize what the Federation is. And I do find that really interesting, and that is very Star Trekian to me, in terms of the discussion. And I like, Spock being like, we focus on, helping our presumed weaknesses and lifting each other up, and we have medical technology, and we care about taking care of others. All of that is very, very good and Star Trekian in what it's trying to showcase. But it's kind of dramatically inert. It's kind of like there's no super big tension of, we're going to steal, tear you apart. And, it's just sort of like them wandering around and getting a tour of the Enterprise. for a decent chunk of the episode, and I just found it a little bit dull in some of its scenes. Also worth mentioning, Cassell and the Martians are very Romulan coded. Did anyone else think that? Like, they had the pointed ears a little bit longer and slightly different, and they certainly had the different forehead things painted on them, but they're like with the green and the pointed ears, like felt very Romulan coded to a degree, which felt odd to me, but regardless, it's not a big deal, neither here nor there. But I just found it kind of inert. And also some weird things going on with this is we have Pike, when he's negotiating with Cassell initially after they take the Enterprise hostage, he feels like an inexperienced captain. He like feels like on the back foot, especially when he's like trying not to let on that they're from the Enterprise. And it's like, I think he asked like at one point, how'd I do to the crew? Kind of goes to like the weird way they write Pike sometimes on this show of him kind of being very unconfident and unsure of himself in a way that doesn't feel befitting of like a captain character. And I just find it kind of odd and undercutting of him as a character. You know, you look at someone like Ake over in Starfleet Academy, who I really liked as a character. I know, bring up Starfleet Academy, danger on this platform, I understand. But I liked her character because, you know, she was an oddball and weird, but still confident in her beliefs and assertions. And I really liked her characterization because she was different, but confident. And Pike, just this show between last season and this season, and at least in this episode, just feels wishy-washy as a commander. And it'd be one thing if the show was analyzing that in some way, but it doesn't seem to be, and it just sort of like plays him as weirdly unconfident and for laughs, and undercuts him as a character for the sort of like putting him on the back foot and kind of humor of the scene in a way that I really don't particularly like. Okay, so the other things that I want to touch upon here is we get the Ortegas, Una, and La'an going down to what turns out to be Earth and dealing with dinosaurs. And this was ultimately fun. I mean, you know, it's kind of very one note in terms of like, yeah, they need to get MacGuffin for the Enterprise, so they have to deal with the dinosaur, and they deal with the dinosaur, and they can't really hurt it because they can't kill anything because it could mess with the timeline, and they get the thing that they need, and there's sort of a little bit of a thematic thing where, you know, they see these bodies and it's like, oh, they're just like us and sort of thing, which again, I like as a connection to Star Trekian themes of like, they're like us, even though they, you know, were insects. And I like that Ortegas is the one to bring it up considering her connection to Gorny last season, and the Gorn that she befriended, but I'm surprised she didn't directly relate that to anything. But there are a few things here too that do frustrate me. One, we have La'an going out and just straight up shooting the dinosaur, and they go like, why'd you shoot it? It's like, oh, it's on stun, but it's like, you're shooting first and asking questions later. This is a problem I had with last season, particularly with the Gorn storyline, where La'an shot first, and it felt very anti-Star Trek to me.
No! Erica, are you...
It kind of goes against the themes of this episode, where you have Pike trying to say, like, we don't shoot first. We come out in peace. We don't want to be violent first. And La'an's just automatically going and shooting things. Might be addressed by something that happens at the end of the episode that I'll get to in a second, but it's certainly something that I was like, not a big fan of that. But then this also ties into the Doldrum, which is the insectoids that are, you know, attacking the Martians. And I believe the ship that landed on Earth was a Doldrum ship, so it's implied the Doldrum have some level of space technology and ability to build ships. And yet the episode treats them as just insects that are just, you know, killing unintelligently. And certainly we are just told that by Cassell, and we don't necessarily get any time with these insects. But it kind of reminds me of the treatment of the Gorn, and how the Gorn are treated both as like this spacefaring species that have, you know, ships, and yet are just like mindless lizards who, you know, are monsters that need to be defeated. And it's like the show can't decide whether they're intelligent beings with thought, or whether they can just be like, you know, just moving on instinct, as we see them sort of get taken out a few times, especially in the beginning of season 3 with the ending of the part 2 storyline of that season. And it's sort of like, what are we doing with these things? And it ultimately leads to my deepest frustration and most angering thing of the episode, which is that Pike, on a hunch, allows the 5th planet in the solar system to be destroyed by Cassell. essentially allowing not only one genocide of that planet directly, but as we see by the end of the episode, causing the asteroid that kills all the dinosaurs on Earth. So indirectly, the Enterprise now is responsible for 2 genocides. Again, indirectly, Cassell was the one who shot the thing, but it's Enterprise technology, and certainly Pike had a chance to stop it and didn't. Now, I know the argument that the show makes and that the episode makes, and what some people may defend this decision to be making is that, well, it was all supposed to happen. If this didn't happen, you know, humanity wouldn't exist, the Federation wouldn't exist. And I get that. I get the sort of bootstraps paradox storyline that this is all trying to set up, but there's no sense of tragedy in that. It's just a thing that Pike allows to happen, and other characters say, like, hey, don't allow this to happen, but there's this sense of inevitability and finality of, like, I can't do anything about it. And I hate it when Star Trek has these allusions to, like, well, this is just fate and we have to let people die because that's just what is meant to happen. It feels very anti-Star Trek to me, even within a bootstraps paradox justification of it. And it frustrates me that Pike allows this to happen. It reminds me in a weird way of another episode that angers me, Star Trek Enterprise's Dear Doctor. That's another episode where we sort of have a planet that has a pandemic that is occurring on it that is ravaging one of the species that lives on the planet. And we learn that there's another species on the planet that isn't affected by the disease. And Phlox, the doctor of the Enterprise in that show, argues, well, this just is what we should allow to happen. It may allow this other species to evolve, and so we shouldn't give them the cure that I have found for this disease because we don't want to mess with their intended evolutionary process. We have to come up with the prime directive to, you know, not interfere with what's going on here because this is the way evolution is naturally supposed to occur.
But we're talking about something that might happen. Might happen thousands of years from now. They've asked for our help. I am not prepared to walk away based on a theory.
Evolution is more than a theory. It is a fundamental scientific principle. Forgive me for saying so. But I believe your compassion for these people is affecting your judgment.
And the episode ends with Captain Archer justifying that and being like, I don't feel comfortable with it, but I'm not here to play God, and we should just let evolution take its natural course, and sort of sets up the creation of the Prime Directive.
But until somebody tells me that they've drafted that directive, I'm going to have to remind myself every day that we didn't come out here to play God.
This sort of alludes to, like, this idea that there is a natural course for evolution, a natural way things are supposed to evolve. And certainly the idea of the Prime Directive of we don't want to unduly influence culture by being, you know, colonizers coming in to, you know, force a direction for a certain culture is a benevolent sort of idea that, you know, gets interrogated within Star Trek, but it was not intended to, or at least it shouldn't be intended to be like, well, there's a natural course for evolution, because it's essentially alluding to, like, predestination, to some sort of, you know, presumed plan for the universe, to God, you know, sort of thing, rather than, like, we, you know, and not that I'm against people having some religious beliefs, and certainly I think that that's something worth exploring in science fiction, as Deep Space Nine does, but it sort of alludes to, like, this natural way that the universe is supposed to go, and by doing so, justifying horrific actions and not getting involved in things, and allowing, in that case, a genocide to, or you know, allowing people to get murdered. And this episode does the same thing, where it sets up, the show itself sets up this situation where it's like, well, we need this to have happen because it's how it's always happened, and by doing so allows the Enterprise to be indirectly involved into genocides and sort of, like, wash its hands of it because it said, well, that's the way it was supposed to go. And it sort of justifies itself on, like, the importance of the Federation coming into being and humanity coming into being. But it's like, isn't that very self-serving? You know? It's self-serving of us to say, like, well, we needed the Federation to come into being, so we're going to allow these 2 planets to die. And I find that kind of repugnant and fatalistic for a Star Trek show to set up as the kind of storyline for its episode, even if it is justified within narrative as the bootstrap paradox of this is how it was always supposed to go. The show didn't need to set up that particular type of paradox, or if it did want to do something like this, maybe have, you know, Pike less directly, you know, allow a genocide to occur. Maybe something he does accidentally causes it, or, you know, whatever. Like, maybe that would be a bit more of a tragic ending for the episode, but to have Pike so willingly sort of abdicate, you know, doing anything because it's the way the thing's supposed to happen, makes me not like Pike even more by the end of this episode, even though the episode tries to make me be like, well, he's thinking about the future and, you know, he's had to constantly think about these consequences. It doesn't work for me. And the fact, too, that this is done with a species called the doldrum, which are these insects, it's like, oh, we make them insects because then it's easier for us to, like, in narrative, like, not care about them. But Star Trek to me is always like, we should care about the insects even though they're insects. You know, they're different from us, but that doesn't mean they're not people. And especially since we get hints that they, like, have space technology and are intelligent, despite what Cassell tells us that they're just, you know, mindlessly killing people. It very much feels like the show is doing the Starship Troopers things of like, oh, they're just bugs worth killing, without realizing that Starship Troopers was directly critiquing that fascist ideology of dehumanizing or depersoning, I guess in that case, these beings. Because by the end of that movie, we learn that the bugs do feel things, are people, do have a society, and actually are just defending themselves.
It's afraid. It's afraid!
And we have intentionally, you know, vilified them within the fascist society of Starship Troopers. But here, while that movie has a level of satire to it, Star Trek here is just, Strange New Worlds is just straight up doing the thing without any sense of satire or awareness. And I find that disappointing for the show to be doing, and kind of goes against the whole theme of like, oh, well, we should work things out with people, you know, as what this show is trying to do. And it sort of has this fatalistic, like, well, they're gonna do that regardless because that's the way it turned out, but at least the Federation's around to do things better now, you know? And it's kind of throwing up its hands in a very disappointing kind of way that I didn't ultimately like. So all of that having been said, a couple last little pieces here to discuss. I will end on a thing that I did like within the storyline is I did like the Universal Translator, translating Pike's version word of alone to widower, with the Martian lady saying like, you know, our culture has many words for widower, and so different words for being alone, and that word was widower that you used within context. And I like this sense of cultural differences and the specific nuances of language sort of revealing things about Pike. Now, how the Universal Translator could read Pike's cultural context to then translate it that way to say that it was widower doesn't really work for me. He just said the word alone, and there was no context within his sentence to lend credence to the translation of widower. So the only way that that would happen is if the Universal Translator kind of knew Pike or could read his mind or what he was thinking. So that doesn't make sense in terms of just technology, but it is at least an interesting concept that the episode plays with, at least a little bit, that I did at least enjoy. I'm trying to give some compliments to the episode. I'm trying not to be such a buzzkill on the whole damn thing. But last thing here, we also have one little piece here with La'an punching the dinosaur, which, to be fair, I thought was fun. La'an punching a dinosaur reactively is, I think, just a fun idea. You know, it's ridiculous and silly and dumb, but sometimes ridiculous and silly and dumb doesn't have to be bad, and I kind of enjoyed it. But we ultimately learned that she was nervous about that because she didn't feel anything, and she's worried that her her augmented DNA may be, coming to the surface or be activated or things like that. You know, she's concerned about, like, am I going to take things over? Like, and Vega makes a kind of joke at that expense, and she takes it earnestly. And then we have Chapel saying, like, your genetics are not what defines you. And so I like that. The show has needed more messages of, like, genetics don't define you. At least it is saying that. But the show has repeatedly shown that it does not always believe that. Again, with the whole, like, 4.5 Vulcans, where the Vulcan DNA suddenly, makes the crew act like stereotypical Vulcans. So DNA does make you that way, presumably, in that episode. Spock, at one point in that same episode, telling La'an, who has become more Romulan-like when her Vulcan DNA was activated, he said something like, this is embedded in your DNA.
You are aggressive, paranoid, suspicious, arrogant. I believe it is part of your core. You are part human, but also part augment. A relative of Khan Noonien Singh. Oh, your DNA does make you genetically more predisposed to evil? It makes you more Romulan-like, and also saying, like, Romulans are more predisposed to evil themselves, by the way, which is
also racist towards Romulans. So it's like the show has not shown that it can handle these storylines well in that regard. So while it is saying one thing, I worry where this storyline is going to go ultimately with Lon, because it feels like it might be doing another thing where it's like, oh, her augment DNA is going to make her more supremacist somehow. Like somehow her DNA has encoded in it supremacist ideology. Like, just because her augment DNA makes her better, harder, faster, stronger does not necessarily mean that you have to be a supremacist about that. But apparently it is because Khan was that way. Khan was a supremacist, presumably is now part of the DNA of all augments to view themselves as supremacists instead of something that was taught to them. I hope that that's not where this storyline is going. I really, really hope not. Again, it's one of those, like, the show could take it in an interesting direction. We shall see. But it has not proven a good track record on that front. So it's just a flag that I'll put out and be like, we'll see where you take it, and I'm willing to go along for the ride. I'm going to try and give you, a fresh, perspective on this, but I also have to at least raise the warning sign of like, your previous history is not, it gives me cause for concern, I guess is the best way to put it. I do, though, at the end, like that Pike and Mbenga have this sort of friendship, and they sort of talk about some of the things about, Pike's feelings about the future. And then also Pike turns down the offer of Admiral, which again I like as just an idea of him just still wanting to focus on, being on the Enterprise for now. And also Una getting to get a promotion, which is also good for her. So that's nice to see. So ultimately, I come down on this episode being like, I find it to be kind of boring, setting up storylines that have me a little reticent, but could go somewhere well, but ultimately are dealing with things that the show has not handled well, ultimately at this point, and I don't necessarily trust this show, but I'm going to try to give it the grace to prove me wrong, without overly condemning it before it gets there. But then the episode storyline itself, I just find to be kind of dramatically inert, and then ultimately ending in a crescendo that I find ethically problematic, and to me, at least what I come to Star Trek for, anti-Star Trek, despite all of its, allusions verbally to the idea of, connection and breaking down warlike mentalities. It ultimately ends up in a storyline that, treats these things as sort of inevitable outcomes that we can't change and we must sort of let happen because it's the way they always do. And hopefully we can do better in the future, but it kind of doesn't earn that concept in its weird bootstraps paradox storyline. Strange New Worlds season 3 premiere. Little bit disappointing. Like I said, I'm gonna try and go into every episode with the hope that the episode will prove me wrong. So I'm not gonna try and come in and bash this season. I'm not gonna hate on this season. I will be honest if I hate an episode, but I'm at least gonna try. I'm at least gonna try as we get through the last 15 episodes of this show now. But man, I just want my Starfleet Academy because I had issues with that show, but man, was it more what I feel like I want thematically and plotline wise from Star Trek. But we'll see. What did you all think about this episode? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down below. Beyond all that, I hope you, my friends, as always, live long and prosper.